It is the week before Christmas, 1974. The weather outside is not the crisp, white snow of a Dickens novel, but a relentless, miserable drizzle that turns the pavement into a grey slurry. The windows are steamed up, condensation running down the glass in rivulets, and the house smells of drying wool, coal smoke, and the sharp citrus tang of tangerines. But inside the living room, the atmosphere is electric with a very specific kind of tension. On the coffee table, resting on a lace doily, sits the most important document of the year, the double issue of the Radio Times. It is thicker than a phone book and smells of fresh ink. A highlighter pen is being wielded like a weapon by the head of the household, aggressively circling the Times for Morecambe and Wise and The Great Escape. This isn't just a TV guide. It is the battle plan for the next fortnight. The shops are about to close, the heating is being turned up to 3, and the sherry has been decanted. We are battening down the hatches. The Great British Christmas, a ritual that is equal parts celebration, endurance test, and military operation, has officially begun. To understand why the British Christmas is so distinct, so peculiarly intense, you have to look first at the environment in which it takes place. The American Christmas, as sold to us by Hollywood, is a scene of snowy driveways, golden retrievers bounding through powder, and neighbors popping round with eggnog. The reality of a British Christmas is somewhat damper. For the vast majority of the 20th century, we did not get deep and crisp and even. We got grey and wet and slush. The sky in December is a heavy, leaden blanket that lowers itself over the rooftops at 3 in the afternoon and doesn't lift until March. The house, in the days before double glazing and combi boilers, was a draughty vessel navigating a sea of freezing fog. And so, the British Christmas evolved as a reaction to this gloom. It became an act of defiance. We built a fortress of light and warmth against the dark, wet winter. We didn't just celebrate, we bunkered down. This siege mentality was driven by a terrified logistical reality that has been entirely forgotten by the modern generation, the shutdown. Today, if you run out of milk on Christmas Day, you can probably find a garage open. If you forget the batteries for the remote control, you can order them for next-day delivery. But in the 1960s and 70s, the country simply stopped. At 4 p.m. on Christmas Eve, the shutters came down, the bolts were drawn, and the high street entered a state of suspended animation that lasted for 3, sometimes 4 days. If you ran out of bread, you went without bread. If you ran out of toilet roll, you improvised. If the lights on the tree blew, there was no replacement. This created a primal panic in the British psyche. The big shop done by your mother in the week leading up to the 25th wasn't just grocery shopping. It was prepping for the apocalypse. Trolleys in Fine Fare or Sainsbury's were piled high with a quantity of food that defied biological logic. We bought enough cheese to feed a battalion. We bought jars of pickled onions the size of artillery shells. We bought 3 different types of stuffing, just in case. Because the fridge was usually a tiny box under the counter, the overflow storage system was activated. This was known as the spare room, or the garage. Because British houses were naturally freezing, the spare bedroom became a walk-in refrigerator. You would walk in there on Christmas Eve to find the turkey resting on a bedside table, covered in a tea towel, surrounded by crates of Double Diamond Ale and bottles of R. White's lemonade. This hoarding instinct was deeply rooted in the memory of the war. For the parents of the 60s and 70s, rationing was a recent memory. The 1950s had been a time of making do, of paper chains made from old newspapers and a chicken instead of a turkey. So, when the consumer boom of the 1970s arrived, the British embraced the excess with a frantic joy. We wanted color, we wanted sugar, we wanted E-numbers. The drab greys of the post-war years were banished by a kaleidoscope of foil wrappers. The tins of Quality Street and roses became the currency of the season. They were massive, metal drums that you could use as a stool if you ran out of chairs. And speaking of chairs, this was the era of the emergency furniture. Because the family was gathering, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, the living room had to be reconfigured. The dining table was extended with a leaf that was a slightly different color to the rest of the wood. Piano stools were dragged in. Camping chairs were unfolded. We squeezed 20 people into a semi-detached front room designed for 4, creating a microclimate of body heat, cigarette smoke, and sherry fumes that was entirely unique to the British Isles. If the stocking of the larder was a testament to logistical planning, the decoration of the house was a triumph of engineering over aesthetics. To walk into a British living room in December 1972 was to enter a world that had abandoned all notions of taste. We didn't do minimalist. We didn't do Scandi chic with tasteful wooden ornaments. We did tinsel, miles and miles of it. The primary architectural feature of the festive home was the paper chain. These didn't come ready-made. They came in a small, flat packet from Woolworths containing hundreds of strips of colored paper gummed on one side like a stamp. It was the job of the children to construct them. For hours, we would sit there, licking the bitter, fishy-tasting glue, looping red through green, yellow through blue, creating a serpentine monster that grew across the carpet. We pinned them to the ceiling with drawing pins. At first, they looked festive, but the British heating system, usually a coal fire or a gas heater on full blast, would attack the glue. By Christmas Eve, the heat would rise, the glue would dry out, and the chains would slowly unpeel, dropping onto the heads of elderly relatives like dying snakes. The ceiling itself was a busy place. We hung foil garlands, concertina geometric shapes that pulled out to reveal spinning metallic diamonds. We pinned Christmas cards to long pieces of red string draped across the walls, a visual display of exactly how popular the family was this year. If the string looked a bit bare, your mother would go out and buy filler cards to pad out the numbers, terrified that the neighbors might think we were social pariahs. And then there was the tree. For many, this was the era of the artificial tree, but not the realistic ones we have today. These were unapologetic, bottle brush constructions made of silver or white plastic, designed to look like they had grown in a radioactive forest. If you did have a real tree, it was a Norway spruce that had been cut down in October. By December 20th, it was a skeleton. The dropping of the needles was a daily tragedy. You couldn't walk across the living room in socks without being stabbed by the dried brown daggers of the spruce, which would embed themselves in the carpet and remain there until Easter. But the true antagonist of the season was the fairy lights. These were not the cool touch LEDs of today. These were hot glass filaments wired in a series circuit. This was a cruel lesson in physics taught to every British father. If one bulb blew, the entire string went dark. The ritual was the same every year. The box would be brought down from the loft. The tangled ball of green wire would be wrestled into submission. It would be plugged in. Nothing. Then began the process of elimination. The father would sit there, armed with a single spare bulb, swapping it out one by one along a string of 50 lights. The tension in the room would be palpable. It was bomb disposal without the armor. When the connection was finally made and the lights flickered into life, there was a cheer that rivaled a goal at Wembley. We also had our own unique televisual decoration ritual, the Blue Peter Advent crown. Every year on the BBC, the presenters would show us how to make a centerpiece using 4 metal coat hangers, a roll of tinsel, and 4 candles. It was a masterpiece of upcycling. Millions of children across the UK would raid their parents' wardrobes, twisting the metal hooks together, wrapping them in flammable plastic tinsel, and sticking lit candles in the middle. In retrospect, it was a terrifying fire hazard, a molten, dripping structure of hot wax and melting plastic. But when you lit that first candle on the first Sunday of Advent, it felt like you were part of a national guild of craftsmen. These decorations were tacky, They were dangerous, and they were often broken before the big day arrived. But they were ours. They transformed the drab beige interior of a 1970s semi-detached house into a glittering, foil-wrapped grotto, setting the stage for the main event, the culinary endurance test of the Christmas dinner. The British Christmas dinner is not a meal. It is a marathon of beige carbohydrates and suet-heavy puddings, designed by our ancestors to provide enough calories to survive a winter on the North Sea. It is a menu that has remained stubbornly unchanged for generations, regardless of changing tastes or modern dietary advice. It begins months before the day itself, with the creation of the Christmas pudding. Sometime in November, usually on Stir-Up Sunday, the mother would assemble a dense, dark mass of dried fruit, suet, brandy, and flour. It looked less like food and more like masonry. Every member of the family had to stir the bowl and make a wish. Then, in a truly bizarre twist, we would throw money into the food. Silver sixpences or 5p pieces were buried in the mix, wrapped in greaseproof paper, or sometimes not, waiting to break the tooth of an unlucky uncle on Christmas Day. The pudding would then be steamed for 8 hours, turning the kitchen into a sauna before being stored in a dark cupboard to mature. By the time it was brought out on December 25th, doused in brandy and set on fire, a pagan ritual if ever there was one, it was a black, cannonball-heavy object of immense density. We ate it not because we liked it, nobody really liked the candied peel, but because it was the law. Then there was the Christmas cake. This was another fruit-heavy brick, but its defining feature was the icing. In the 1970s, royal icing was the standard. This dried to a consistency harder than concrete. To cut the Christmas cake required a serrated knife and considerable upper body strength. The icing would shatter into shards, and the marzipan layer underneath would provide a sickly, sweet barrier to the fruit. We would often find pieces of a plastic snowman or a small plastic fir tree embedded in the icing, saved from the previous year and wiped clean. The savory course was dominated by a sauce that baffles the rest of the world: bread sauce. Try explaining this to an American or a Frenchman. We take stale bread, we soak it in milk with an onion stuck with cloves, and we boil it until it looks like porridge. It is essentially wet bread, yet without it, the turkey, which was almost always dry because it had been in the oven since 4 a.m., was inedible. It was the lubricant of the meal. And let us not forget the Brussels sprouts. Every year, the same argument. Do we have to have them? Yes, it's tradition. In the 70s, the concept of roasting or sautéing a sprout did not exist. They were boiled, but not just boiled. They were subjected to a cross-cut on the bottom to help them cook evenly, a complete myth, and then boiled until they were a uniform, sulphurous gray mush. They smelled of school dinners. We ate them under duress, usually hiding them under a piece of turkey skin or swallowing them whole like pills. But the real battlefield of the season was the confectionery. The tin of Quality Street versus the tin of roses. Families were divided by tribal loyalties. You were either a Macintosh family, Quality Street, or a Cadbury family, Roses. The arrival of the tin signaled that Christmas had started. The lid would be pried off, and the good ones would vanish instantly. In a Quality Street tin, the green triangle, noisette, and the purple one, hazelnut and caramel, were the gold dust. They would be gone by Boxing Day morning. What remained until February were the toffee pennies and the coconut eclairs. The toffee penny was a dental hazard, a flat disc of caramel so hard it could pull a filling out clean. You would find them lingering at the bottom of the tin weeks later, rejected by everyone, a sad reminder of the festive gluttony. This obsession with specific, often quite strange foods wasn't about culinary excellence. It was about continuity. We ate the hard icing, the boiled sprouts, and the dried turkey because that is what we had always done. It was the taste of British stability. If the food was the endurance test, the dining table was the stage for a unique piece of British theatre. The centerpiece of this performance, an object absolutely baffling to any non-Briton, was the Christmas cracker. To an outsider, it looks insane. We sit down to a formal meal, and before we eat, we pick up a cardboard tube wrapped in foil. We cross arms with the person next to us, creating a chain of tension around the table. 1, 2, 3. Pull! There is a crack, a smell of gunpowder, that distinctive acrid scent of the snap, and the contents spill onto the tablecloth. And what contents? Inside every cracker were 3 mandatory items, unchanged for decades. First, the paper hat. It was made of tissue paper so thin it was transparent. It was usually ill-fitting, ripping immediately as you tried to put it on. But the rule was absolute. Everyone must wear the hat. It didn't matter if you were the rebellious teenager, the dignified grandfather, or the Queen herself. You wore the hat. There is something profoundly British about seeing a serious family argument over politics conducted by people wearing wonky, neon-pink crowns. It leveled the hierarchy. For 1 hour, we all looked equally ridiculous. Second, the plastic toy. A tiny red fish that curled up on your hand. The fortune teller. A miniature magnifying glass that didn't work. A small plastic frog. It was landfill in waiting, useless tat that would be swept up with the turkey bones, yet we coveted it for those few minutes. Third, the motto, the joke. These were intentionally terrible. What do you call a penguin in the desert? Lost. A groan would go around the table. That was the point. If the jokes were good, it wouldn't work. The collective groan was a bonding moment, a shared acknowledgement of the absurdity of the situation. The table itself had a strict geography. There was the main table, extended to its limits, groaning under the weight of the best china that only came out once a year. And then, banished to the corner or sometimes the hallway, was the kids' table. The kids' table was a lawless zone. It was a card table or a camping table, slightly lower than the main one. Here, cousins kicked each other under the cloth, mixed all their drinks into a potion, and dared each other to eat the sprouts. Being promoted from the kids' table to the main table was a rite of passage, a signal that you had officially entered adulthood, though it usually meant you had to listen to your uncle explain his car insurance for 2 hours. And then, at 3 p.m., a hush would descend. The cutlery would be put down. The room would fall silent. The Queen's speech. In the 1970s, this wasn't optional. There were only 3 channels, and 2 of them were broadcasting it. But it was more than just a lack of choice. It was the anchor of the day, the image of the monarch, sitting in a room much grander than ours, talking about the Commonwealth, gave the day a sense of formality. We stood, or at least sat up straight, for the national anthem. It was the dividing line. Before the speech, the day was about chaos and cooking. After the speech, the pressure lifted, the belt buckles were loosened, the washing up was tackled, and we moved towards the true religion of the British Christmas, television. If the lunch was the physical peak of the day, the cultural climax occurred at exactly the same time in 20 million living rooms across the country. By 4 p.m., the digestion had set in. The paper hats had slipped to jaunty angles. The washing up had been done in a frenzy of steam and marigolds, and then the entire family migrated to the lounge. The chairs were turned to face the corner of the room. The curtains were drawn against the dark, wet afternoon. The main lights were turned off, leaving only the hypnotic blinking of the fairy lights and the glow of the cathode ray tube. We were gathering around the electronic hearth. In the 1970s, the Christmas television schedule was a monolithic structure. It dictated the rhythm of the digestion. There was no on-demand. There was no recording it for later. You watched it live, or you missed it forever. This created a sense of national synchronization that is impossible to imagine in the fragmented digital age. First came the big film. This was usually a war movie or a James Bond, The Great Escape, or The Sound of Music. In an era before VHS, DVD, or streaming, seeing a blockbuster film on TV was a major event. It was the only way to see it. We sat there, stuffed with turkey, watching Steve McQueen jump that fence on a motorbike for the 5th year in a row, and we loved it. It was comfort viewing. It was the visual equivalent of the bread sauce. Familiar, warm, and reliable. But the true apex of the British Christmas, the moment that defined the 1970s, was the Morecambe and Wise Christmas Special. It is hard to explain the magnitude of this show to anyone under the age of 40. It wasn't just a comedy sketch show, it was a state occasion. In 1977, 28 million people watched it. That was half the population of the United Kingdom. Think about that. Half the country was sitting in the dark at exactly the same moment, laughing at exactly the same joke. The streets outside were deserted. The pubs were empty. If you walked down a terraced street in 1976, you would see the blue flicker of the TV sets in every window pulsing in unison. Eric and Ernie were the masters of the Christmas variety. They brought on serious newsreaders like Angela Rippon and made them dance. They brought on Andre Previn and made him play all the right notes, but not necessarily in the right order. It was a unifying force. For 60 minutes, the class divisions of Britain, the differences between the North and South, the factory floor and the management office, evaporated. We were all just laughing at Eric slapping Ernie's cheeks. It gave us a collective memory. When you went back to work or school, you didn't ask, "Did you see it?" You asked, "Which was your favorite bit?" This was the peak of the shared Christmas. We were trapped in our houses by the weather and the closed shops, but we were connected by the signal beaming from the transmitter. It was a benevolent dictatorship of entertainment. We watched what we were given, and we were grateful for it. And then, just as the sugar crash from the Quality Street hit, we woke up to the strangest, most peculiarly British day of the year. Boxing Day. To the rest of the world, December 26th is just the day after Christmas. People go back to work. The magic is gone. But in Britain, Boxing Day was, and in many ways still is, a distinct cultural entity with its own melancholy atmosphere. In the 1970s, the shutdown was still in full effect. The shops were still firmly closed. There were no Boxing Day sales. The high street was a ghost town, wind-blowing litter past the darkened windows of Woolworths. The mood inside the house shifted. Christmas Day was about frantic energy, cooking, and performance. Boxing Day was about the hangover, both literal and metaphorical. The pressure was off. The house was a mess of wrapping paper and pine needles. The fridge was full of leftovers. And this gave birth to the tradition of the Boxing Day walk. It was mandatory. "We need to blow the cobwebs away," your father would announce. It didn't matter that it was raining sideways. It didn't matter that the countryside was a muddy quagmire. The family would be bundled into coats, scarves, and wellies and marched out into the grey landscape. We walked along canal paths, across sodden fields, or along deserted beaches where the wind whipped the sand into your face. We passed other families doing exactly the same thing, nodding grimly to each other. It was a penitence for the gluttony of the day before. We walked until our noses were red and our toes were numb, just so we could feel, justified in going back home to eat more cake. And the food on Boxing Day was arguably better than the main meal. It was the day of bubble and squeak, fried leftovers, and cold cuts. The turkey, now looking like a car wreck, was stripped for sandwiches. The ham was sliced. A jar of piccalilli, that neon yellow acidic pickle that sat in the cupboard for 364 days a year, was opened. It was a day of grazing. There were no set meal times. You just walked into the kitchen, cut a slice of something, and walked out. But in the late 1980s, this bubble burst. The sanctity of the shutdown was breached. The Sunday trading laws were relaxed. The big department stores realized there was money to be made. The Boxing Day sale arrived. Suddenly, December 26th wasn't a day of rest and leftovers. It became a day of commerce. People started queuing outside Next at 5 a.m. to buy discounted sofas. The silence of the high street was replaced by the roar of traffic. The spell of the 3-day siege was broken. We weren't bunkering down anymore. We were rushing out to buy more stuff. The pause button that had been pressed on the nation's life was unpressed, and the relentless hum of the economy restarted 24 hours earlier. The Boxing Day walk still exists, but it feels different now. We walk knowing that the shops are open. We walk knowing that the world hasn't stopped. The deep, collective hibernation of the 1970s Christmas was over, replaced by the convenience of the modern world. The erosion of the Britishness of Christmas didn't stop with the Boxing Day sales. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, a slow cultural creep began to cross the Atlantic. The distinct, slightly eccentric edges of our island traditions were sanded down by the global juggernaut of American culture. The first casualty was the name. In the 1970s, he was strictly Father Christmas. He wore a long red robe, sometimes green in older books. He was a bit austere, and he was definitely English. He didn't say ho 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 in a deep baritone. He spoke like a kindly grandfather, but gradually he was replaced by Santa Claus. The Coca-Cola version, the Santa of the movies, took over. We stopped leaving out a mince pie and a sherry, a very British snack for a driver, and started leaving out cookies and milk. Then came the elf on the shelf. In the 1970s, the idea of a surveillance elf moving around your house would have been terrified. It sounds like something from a horror film. But today, it is standard practice. It is a manufactured tradition, imported wholesale, demanding a level of nightly creativity from parents that would have baffled the 1970s mother. You want me to make the elf bake a miniature cake? I've got a turkey to defrost in the bath, love. We also lost the pantomime as a strictly local event. The panto is, admittedly, still with us. It is the one glorious, unexplainable survivor. Men dressed as women, women dressed as boys, throwing sweets at the audience and shouting, "It's behind you." It is a fever dream of British surrealism, but in the old days, the panto was often amateur. It was the local dramatic society in the village hall. The principal boy was the woman who ran the post office. The dame was the local butcher. Today, the panto is a slick commercial machine starring a reality TV star from Love Island or a retired soap actor. It's polished, it's expensive, and it's lost a bit of that shonky, homemade charm where the scenery might fall over, and the horse was clearly two blokes in a duvet cover. We traded the homemade for the perfect. In the 70s, decorations were often made by hand. Paper chains, painted pine cones, cotton wool glued to card to look like snow. They looked terrible, but they were ours. Now we buy tasteful, pre-lit trees. We buy coordinated bauble sets. Our living rooms look like showroom windows, beautiful but sterile. We have outsourced the magic to the factories. But the most profound loss wasn't aesthetic. It was social. The death of the shared experience is the real ghost at the feast of the modern Christmas. In 1977, when 28 million people watched Morecambe and Wise, the nation was synchronized. We were all in the same room, metaphorically speaking. The next day, the conversation at the bus stop, in the factory canteen or over the garden fence was identical. Did you see it? It was a social glue that bound us together. Today, that glue has dissolved. The fragmentation of media means that a family of 4 can be sitting in the same lounge on Christmas Day, but inhabiting 4 completely different worlds. Dad is watching a war film on the TV. Mum is scrolling through Facebook on her iPad. The teenager is watching YouTube on a phone. The youngest is playing Fortnite on a Switch. We are physically together, but mentally apart. There is no big film that everyone watches. There is no national moment. The silence of the streets is gone, but the silence in the living room has deepened. We have headphones on. We are curating our own individual Christmases, tailored to our specific algorithmic preferences. And with social media came the pressure of perfection. In the 1970s, nobody saw your Christmas except your immediate family. It didn't matter if the turkey was burnt. It didn't matter if the tree was wonky. It didn't matter if the trifle looked like a road accident. There was no evidence. Today, the performance of Christmas is public. We photograph the table settings. We filter the tree. We post images of perfect families in matching pajamas. Another American import. We are constantly comparing our reality to the curated highlights of strangers. This creates a new kind of anxiety. The 1970s anxiety was logistical. Will the turkey fit in the oven? The modern anxiety is existential. Is my Christmas magical enough? Does it look like the ones on Instagram? Sir, we have gained convenience. We have gained choice. We have gained central heating, thank God. But we have lost the chaotic, slightly disappointing, communal mess that made the British Christmas so unique. We have swapped the unpredictable danger of the exploding fairy lights for the safety of the LED, and in doing so, we have dimmed the glow just a little bit. And yet, despite the smartphones and the Sunday trading, the core of the British Christmas remains stubbornly, wonderfully weird. We still buy the sprouts, even if we now roast them with bacon to make them palatable. We still pull the crackers, wear the flimsy paper hats, and groan at the terrible jokes. We still engage in the passive-aggressive war over the Quality Street tin. Why? Because these rituals are the anchor points of our year. In a world that changes at terrifying speed, the immutability of the British Christmas is a comfort. The fact that the bread sauce tastes exactly the same as it did in 1974 is not a culinary failure. It is a triumph of continuity. The British Christmas was never really about the food or the presents or even the religion. It was about the act of gathering. It was about closing the door against the grey, wet winter, turning on the fire and saying, for the next 3 days, the world outside does not exist. We are here, we are warm, and we have chocolate. So this year, when you sit down at the table and put on that ridiculous paper crown, take a moment to look around. You are participating in a ritual of resilience that has survived wars, recessions, and the arrival of the internet. It is chaotic, it is stressful, and it is often slightly damp. But it is ours. And in the bleak midwinter, that is all the magic we really need.